3 decades almost, is the pervasive nature of discussions about globalization. And what's, of course, interesting about globalization is that before 1990, almost no one, doesn't work, but almost no one used this concept. This is from Ngram. If you haven't seen it, it's actually very interesting. It's always a good first step toward understanding valence of the new concepts in this period. So basically, if you punch in globalization, basically it just only begins to appear in the 1980s, but of course it begins up. There was always the other concept, internationalization, which began sometime around the time of World War I. But by and large, when we think today about how the world is becoming somehow integrated, we use the concept of globalization. Okay, so one of the things that's interesting, though, at the same time, about academic discourses on globalization is that even as they were saying that this is actually a contemporary phenomenon, that is something that was really only happening very recently, it turns out the more closely you look at history, and in particular world history, it turns out that something like globalization has been happening in the past. So certainly by outbreak of World War I, the world was said to be quite globalized. And if you reflect further, European colonialism was, of course, making the world integrated in some way. And of course, you can always go back to the European discovery of the rest of the world, Americas in particular. But it turns out you can always go all the way back to the beginning of human history, because human beings began to migrate very rapidly after the day came to be. So globalization in one articulation is simply world history, or history of human beings. And yet, when we then think about how people try to treat this phenomenon, it turns out that we haven't actually been very good about doing so. There are always, as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, certain discourses about other people, others. And it's only with the European Enlightenment that people began to speak of others in a slightly more positive way. Though, of course, you can always say some of the Greek writers, like Herodotus, actually had positive things to say about certain types of people. But nonetheless, in kind of early modern West, it's these Enlightenment figures like Montesquieu or Voltaire, Leibniz, who began to actually say something positive. But it's only really with the rise of Orientalism, sometime in the mid-19th century, in France, Germany, to a lesser extent England and elsewhere, that they began to try to understand the rest of the world. And as I mentioned very briefly, area studies that come to be in post-World War II period begins to really begin to try to make sense of the world outside of Europe and the United States. But the point I'm interested in here is a very simple question. Given that human beings, or these putative societies, seem so obviously different, how do we make sense of them? No one really believed that people were the same all over the world. It's impossible to do so. It's just different. So the question really becomes, how do you name these differences? And I want to suggest that there are really two fundamental ways in which people try to make sense of differences that they saw in different cultures and societies. One is by way of social evolutionary theory, and the other, much less common, was an effort to assert a certain sense of cultural or civilizational autonomy and distinction. The more common way which I'll just call a convergence thesis, was the belief that, yes, it's true that there are societies or cultures that are different in fundamental institutions, values, ways of life, but that they will actually begin to converge and eventually become similar, if not the same. And the stronger version, which was actually the most common version, was that they'll converge with the European or the American form. That is to say, the idea of being modern was to be more Western. And so if you look at either modernization theory, which some people thought was very conservative politically in the 60s and 70s, wasn't always the case, or Marxism, as I mentioned at the outset, they actually converge in this sense. Right? They actually agree that past differences will wither away and eventually disappear. And in particular, both schools of thought actually argue that the fundamental engine, the fundamental cause of the disappearance of this division was something like industrialization and social processes associated with it. Urbanization, the emergence of the nuclear family, so on and on. So in the context of post-World War II era, both against the second world of communists, but more importantly, third world of unallied countries, there was a real effort to try to assert that all these places were trying to become more modern, more Western. So the programmatic of the social sciences actually became a curiously policy-oriented or practical, given the differences, which were usually called traditions. So whatever you found in Turkey circa 1950s, Taiwan 1950s, Kenya 1950s, didn't matter. They're all said to be traditions. And the question then was, how do you make them modern? How do you bring these traditional societies into a full modernity? And this became both kind of the epistemic and also the political background of much of post-World War II social sciences. And so if you ever have time, one of the hobbies you could have is to read through those vast literature, which I did, not as a hobby. It's really always impressive how much you learn in graduate school is completely useless, except as something you make fun of 30 years later as a student. So modernization theory would have people saying, for example, that what you want to do is bring a more modern orientation to these traditional backward people. But the point I wanted to make was slightly different. So in political sociology or political anthropology, one of the interesting things was that they would distinguish between pre-modern polities with modern polities. That is to say, modern polities, what matters is achievement. What you do as a person. That makes you, say, president or prime minister. Whereas in traditional societies, what matters is things like which family you're born in. In modern societies or polities, politicians change constantly because there are the objective and neutral rules for determining. So it's hard to monopolize. But in pre-modern societies, the same people continue to rule. But if you look at the US, right? I mean, everyone goes to the same school. And most people who are presidential candidates have the same last name. They come from the same family. They're usually named Bush or Gore or something like that. Maybe Clinton. So one of the ironies of modernization theory is actually it's the analysis of traditional politics that actually apply to the politics of U.S. politics today. But I'm just making fun of that. But even though modernization theory, as I say, was quite hegemonic in the social scientific world and was taught to many people from the so-called third world, I think it never really achieved assent among scholars. And I think this is true for two reasons. One is very simple, that they have these nice general theories that we're going to go from ascription-oriented, that is to say, society in which everything was determined by your birth, to one determined by achievement. Then it was going to be a society in which emotions, feelings, and all these rational things would give away to rationality. That people become increasingly reasonable and rational. That rather than particular ties of family, friends, kinship, that people rely on essentially neutral ties. And these things were nice in theory, but of course didn't fit the facts, and it certainly didn't seem to make sense, though, but people thought that they actually studied places from Japan to Indonesia, to Tanzania, to Peru. That is to say, the reality seemed very different, that these societies didn't obviously seem to be going in the modern direction. And the differences seem to be quite acute and persistent. So that's kind of the everyday perception of how the world was. But more importantly, when policymakers try to apply things to various parts of the world, they everywhere run into problems. Maybe people didn't really want to become modern, or that modernity seemed, in a sense, much farther away than people imagined. You couldn't just tell them to start working hard, you couldn't just tell them to be rational, you couldn't just tell them to stop being corrupt. So one reason, I think, that modernization theory never really found to pop in some way is that the differences seem so profound, and that they were not so obviously being alleviated by policy instruments that people were using. But the second and more important reason, I think, is that people began to see that there were distinct logics to the places that they were studying. That tradition as such was not a useful concept, because in these supposed societies without history, there were always historical dynamics at work. And what was true in 1950, as it turned out, wasn't true in 1900, as it wasn't true before European colonial influences, missionaries, trade, and so on and on. And so, with the rise of area studies, what happened in fact was people just began to know more. People began to study things and came to realize that differences were actually much deeper. Not only in the sense that they were different from the West, but that the differences were constantly being produced and reproduced, and in very different ways. That you couldn't talk about a stagnant or stable Taiwan or Indonesia or any other places that we were studying. Historical dynamics, regional diversity, so on and on. And as people began to become less ethnocentric in their scholarship, it's also the time many people from these places come to centers in Europe or North America and study. And of course, they, with their local knowledge, came to have real questions about easy ways in which European or American scholars can characterize their countries. So with these two arrows pointing at the same target, the target, I think, basically fell in some way. Although, as you probably noticed, American policymakers, for example, had long-standing belief in something like modernization theory or convergence thesis. The other way of thinking, I will just call civilization theory, which is to just presume that differences are actually very deep, but to add the proviso that they cannot be changed easily, or that they will not be changed. So in many fields, people began to insist that these differences have long pedigree, a very long history, and that we cannot expect, for example, certain Arab societies to become different from what they were, become democratic if that's what you thought, or for Asian society to become non-Confucian and more democratic, and so on. The problem with this theory, of course, as exemplified by Samuel Hunting's Clash of Civilization, was in fact that they came to be used in slightly reactionary way, that Asians or Arab people did not know the fact, for example. And 9/11 became kind of a bellwether, meaning that with the recognition that there were some people who wanted to kill themselves and attack American buildings, that perhaps these people were not capable of change. The weird thing about civilizational theory was that in one sense, that they wanted to insist on a particular theoretical perspective. Namely, that what is moving or what is motivating the difference of distinction is something that we will call culture. Sometimes religion, sometimes values, but fundamentally culture. And that the culture was in many ways immobile and very difficult, if not impossible, to change. So the argument really had to do with how, yes, in many ways people might begin to act as part of global capitalism, bank at institutions, invest in stocks, wear suits, visit McDonald's and so on, but that these economic manifestations don't necessarily to be cultural change. And as I mentioned, because of this primacy of culture, there was a sense in which the explanation took kind of prescriptive, meaning that there's no point in trying to make society more democratic because their culture was fundamentally undemocratic. There's no use talking about human rights in some places because they just don't have respect for individuals and their rights and so on. Well, the problem, of course, was that it wasn't so neat, right? That in some ways, that what they thought were completely differences were far from stable, as I mentioned for modern clinician theory, and that change was constant. And in particular, people began to realize, as they did more research, that something like culture was actually at the forefront of change in many ways, at the forefront of something like globalization. I mean, if we think about one of the major forces that split through the world, the rise of global diligence, of course, this was a very translocal trans-regional phenomena that had huge impact everywhere. And so even when we talk about the West as such, that we begin to realize it's actually much more mixed than we thought it was. I mean, in the US, people like to talk about Judeo-Christian religion in part to rectify against the tradition of anti-Semitism. But in many ways, it's more accurate to talk about Judeo-Islamo-Christian tradition, in part because it's hard to think about Western civilization without thinking about Islam. I mean, I mentioned very briefly that the university system as such had huge power in one of the private institutions and so on. But in almost everything we do, obviously in the field of learning, philosophy, algebra, whatever have you, the Islamic way. The only point I'm trying to make is that these differences, these traditions were far from stable and certainly far from being immune to translocal, trans-regional influences. The final point I'll make is that there's always a problem with civilizational theory because people never really specified which unit of analysis they were using. Because civilization often implied something very large, like the Sino-centric culture, like Islam, cultural sphere, like the West. And yet, of course, the unit of analysis in modern social sciences was the nation state. And people didn't actually know what to make of that. And furthermore, people found all sorts of subnational, local differences, which again couldn't be made sense of by appealing to something like civilization. So in many ways, civilizational theory turned out to be much more problematic than it seemed on the surface. And in particular, what I want to stress is the problematic way in which people use tradition or the idea of tradition, especially in civilizational theory, but I think also in modernization theory. Because I think when people think about tradition, they think of it a bit like a family tree. You know, there's the origin, you know, you have children and they go down. So tradition is something that just kind of goes down. However, sorry, I think I told you I'm terrible at making these visuals. They're supposed to be 90 degrees this way, so this is the bottom. But there's another way of thinking, which is, of course, that you, of course, have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and very soon you have millions of ancestors. Right? I mean, there's a statistician, Douglas Statistics at Yale, who claims that statistically, the chance that someone who is alive today in East Asia can trace ancestry to Confucius is almost 100%. Just like people who lived, claim to be European, Central and Western European, there's almost 100% chance of laying some ancestry to Charlemagne, the guy who united Europe in the 800s. It's almost 100%. The reason, of course, is that ancestors multiply. And so you capture a lot of people who are alive, not many generations. If you don't, I'm sure some of you are good at math, you interact with math. You know how things just multiply. And so it's just a matter, I think, of how you think about tradition. And I think we think tradition in kind of this bizarre, purist way. That it begins with one person or a couple. So the purity is maintained. So everything else doesn't count. But again, if you flip this tree, actually, you are a product of everything, or almost everything. And in this regard, I should remind you that Homo sapiens really only arose, Homo sapiens sapiens, all of us, only arose about 100,000 years ago. So it's not very, very long ago. So we share much more than we suspect. Okay. So once we slightly change our perspective on tradition, it turns out that tradition is actually not this homogeneous, linear thing that gets passed down from time to time. And one of the reasons we know this is not the case is the point I made in my first lecture, that if you go back to the past, there wasn't much cultural integration. So a particular tradition that gets passed down is usually a more recent one, which has been integrated for you and taught to you in schools, history books, sometimes from parents or mass media. Kind of a crude way to put it is, of course, the more immediately, most people hail from peasants, because most of the people in the world, at least in East Asia, were peasants. And yet, these peasants, of course, had completely different culture in many ways from the elite landlords, kings, emperors, what have you. And it's not the same tradition they bestowed, except that in retrospect, we have integrated them. We have given them status integration. So everyone who claims to be part of Chinese civilization can lay claim to the glories of Chinese civilization, which is whatever Han poetry already done. But in fact, if you do it slightly more narrowly, you can't do this because the slice of culture is very narrow, and if particular status situations suggest that maybe you didn't belong to this elite culture. So what happens, in fact, then, is that the tradition gets handed down not so much as something that slowly changes, if at all, over time, but something that gets invented quite recently. So what really happens is that at some point, usually a nation state, which takes responsibility over people's education, creates a particular narrative about your nation state, over your history, and then this becomes what the tradition is. At the same time, what's interesting about this is that until these things become systematically delineated in national history and national culture and national social science, is that because much of the knowledge was oral in character, it actually changed constantly. That is to say, this idea of tradition really didn't exist in the past because things were changing constantly. Your parents may have said this, my grandparents may have said this, but if they were written down, then there's no reason to believe that they're fixed. Right? Memories are faulty, oral transmission is very problematic. So it's only when these become documented, systematized in history books and so on, that they become kind of a reified product that you can pass down. And it's only then that you can have a tradition around which you can have arguments. But until then, you didn't have this. Because there was tradition as we think of it was so amorphous as to be not part of a struggle. So the bottom line I try to insist on is that yes, there were two different perspectives, convergence theory and civilizational theory. And again, I want to stress again that convergence theory includes both Marxism and modernization theory. So it's very, very diverse. But in retrospect, what strikes me most is how almost all of them share a set of assumptions, which to me are quite problematic. They're quite problematic for the reasons I mentioned in the first two lectures, but they speak to kind of the limitations of the conceptual apparatus we have at our disposal. We're just so attuned to thinking in terms of the nation state, the integrity of it, history or tradition as linear and relatively pure, about how it's always been integrated in terms of status and culture, on and on and on, or how we can divide society or culture into different distinct spheres like politics, economy, and social. But these are actually conditions that prevail at best in modern nation states and not in the past. So every time we project it, we misrecognize the past. And so, in a way, even though there are tremendous differences across all these theories, what strikes me at present is how they actually share the same set of assumptions. The set of assumptions that systematically, I think, misrecognize the past. So I have three set of summaries that I want to present before I move on to my other topic for today's lecture. To even talk about globalization in these stages is problematic because actually both terms are actually much more problematic than we let on. Globalization is not something that begins in 1990, 1989, but something that you can trace all the way back to the beginning of human beings. And East Asia, by and large, had largely nominal abilities. But the way in which globalization becomes important is that it takes over all these distinct theoretical positions, like modernization theory and Marxism, and supersede them and create a vision of the world that is rapidly integrated and being homogenized, and I think has a profound ideological impact, in part because it projects telos or goal endpoint, which seems inevitable, natural, and in many ways necessary. That it seems obviously that the future is a much more globalized world, much more homogeneous world, where we all eating the same kinds of food, thinking in the same kinds of way, but most importantly, things like free trade, capitalism, all these good things are supposedly inevitable. So globalization as a discourse, I think, has a profound ideological connotation. And that's why one should be somewhat skeptical when we use the concept of globalization. The second thing, of course, is this idea of the nominal character of East Asia unity. And in particular, it's nice that civilizational theory provides one way of understanding it, but I think it's not all that useful because actually the past wasn't all that simple. And I'm not going to go through this over again, but cultural disintegration was what characterized East Asia for much of its history. And of course, status integration, the divide between the literate elite and non-literate, largely peasant population, was simply profound. And so when either civilizational theorists or nationalists today in East Asia try to talk about tradition, I find it very problematic for the same reason I find nationalists problematic, that they use a very problematic category to describe the past and the present. The final summary is just to reiterate my sense of the limitations of conventional social sciences practiced in the West and elsewhere today. One is, of course, that one way to avoid the flow of convergence theory or civilizational theory is actually to be slightly less ethnocentric and more comparative. Once you begin to look at different places, different cultures, and different societies, one begins to appreciate that something that you may have thought very unique about your own society, in fact, is not so. And likewise, something that you thought is completely generic, which is the other flaw, to think that everyone is like you, can also be avoided. And in so doing, you wouldn't actually have faith in either colonization theory, or for that matter, civilizational theories. Second is, of course, the inevitability and the necessity of history, historicizing. Because past is not only the proverbial foreign country, but it doesn't actually flow all that smoothly. And by studying a bit more, infusing your studies with history, we find that there's never a simple continuity or radical rupture, as people like it to be. The third is a very simple point about the importance of inter- or transdisciplinary work, because disciplinary perspectives, as useful as they may be, often create blinders. And finally, it's a very obvious point to most historians today, but still quite rare in the social sciences, that there is no magic bullet in human history or society. It's nice if it were the case that everything moved because of class struggle or technological change, but the evidence of past and other societies suggests that this is simply not. Okay, let me go back again and talk about globalization in East Asia in a slightly more positive way. By positive, I don't mean, I just need more empirical data. As I mentioned, globalization arises as a dominant idea about what is happening in the world after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Capitalism seems triumphant, inevitable. Financialization and free trade are something that seems to take hold of the world. And concomitantly, it seems that nation state is in decline. So social scientists begin to talk about things like post-citizens, post-national. Everything becomes post, because the Cold War era of nation state and so on seems forever behind us. So it's not surprising, it's precisely at the same time that people found so much attraction in postmodern theory. And finally, people begin to take seriously the idea of cultural globalization, that now everywhere you go, you seem to be able to get by speaking English, and global popular culture does exist in the sense that you hear the same kind of music in many, many different places. So that's the phenomenology of globalization. And yet, a moment's reflection will suggest that this is not the only story. counter-globalization is actually as much of a powerful trend. And there are many, many different articulations of this. One is, of course, the rise of subnational governments. And there are two sorts of things. One, of course, is the salience of non-state actors. And this ranges from non-government organizations, international organizations, to terrorist organizations. Until very, very recently, the Department of Defense or your military knew exactly who you were fighting. You were fighting other nations' military. Now people aren't so sure. How do you fight terrorism? A concept. And certainly something like Al-Qaeda is not obviously a nation state. It's a very loose network of people who are dedicated to certain ideas. At the same time, it seems that nation state seems so robust. It seems to be this establishing themselves everywhere. Right? If you read newspapers, it's hard to not read headlines about how people in Quebec in Canada want to secede and be independent. In Canada, Catalonians really want to be separate from Spain. Scotland wants to vote for independence or autonomy. And this, of course, goes against the mindset of the nation state, right? Because even though it wasn't actually the case in most nation states, that there was this simple idea that one nation, one state, one language, one ethnicity. It's in fact nowhere the case. This is nowhere the case. But for a while, social scientists pretended as though that this was actually the case, which is why in many parts of the world people assume that if you go to Brazil, people speak Brazilian. Right? There was a vice president who was not Americans, so not. Anyway, so it's surprising to most people, I think, when you think about Catalonia, that it's part of Spain. So everyone must speak Spanish, right? But of course that's not true, because what we call Spanish is really Castilian, kind of a regional language that became dominant. And it's the modern nation state, especially in Spain's case under Franco's rule, really tried hard to squelch and extinguish regional languages. And this was true actually in much of Europe even. In 20th century. A long time in France, they wanted everyone to speak French, so you can speak Breton or whatever of the regional languages that existed. This is everywhere in decline, but one element of this is that what we used to think was an integrated nation state, like Spain. I mean, I bet you no one here, until Catalonian secession movement became news, that Spain would break up because everything was Spain, Spanish, same language, same religion, blah, 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 same history. At the same time, it seems like another thing you find reading newspapers where you just look at the internet headline is this amazingly recrudescent nationalism. That is to say, if you look at the recent EU election, we find these, for lack of better words, these right-wing populist groups, nationalist groups, that the main point they sort of have is that they don't really want to be cosmopolitan, European, and they certainly don't want foreigners, immigrants, in their midst. So anti-immigration nationalism is a very, very powerful force, wherever you look. Certainly true in the U.S. with the rise of Tea Party. And it's in part, of course, kind of a counter-globalization movement. Thirdly, at the same time, you find all sorts of interesting regional integration happening. EU being the most obvious European Union, but they try to create supranational organizations that do what nation states used to monopolize. The fundamental reason for all this I want to suggest. It has a lot to do with the crisis of the nation state as it took shape in the 20th century, from 1990s to 20th century. I mean, if you think about what made the nation states tick, I think you have to actually go back to Max Weber's definition of the state as a political organization that has a monopoly of violence, legitimate violence. And in many ways, the making of modern state have a lot to do with geopolitics and war. Why did the state expand? Well, you needed to protect citizens, supposedly subjects. And in turn, of course, wars made states. So Charles Tilly, a sociologist, once famously argued that the modern state was a bit like mafia. What do mafia do? They do many things, but one of the things they do is offer a protection method. Essentially, you say, you belong to my territory, you pay me money, protection money, I will protect you. And modern state was a bit like that. You say you belong to this territory, and the state will protect you. You pay me taxes to support the welfare. I mean, it's a very simplistic story, that's not the whole of it, but nonetheless there's some truth in that. But what happens by 21st century is that the idea of national security no longer has such a compelling narrative. That especially in Europe, but even in America and elsewhere, people don't actually truly believe that national security is always in such a horrible state. That war doesn't seem that likely. I mean, it's still used, a lot of people believe it, but I think it's in decline almost like that. So one of the main pillars of a modern nation state is getting weak, more prominent a bit. And certainly if you think about how many people truly want to die for their own country, no one has actually done surveys, unfortunately. I would bet you my life that is the case. If you look at most European societies, certainly true in the US too, they're beginning to give up universal construction. So, for example, one of the things that's interesting about US is, US has wars all the time. Gulf War, 1 and 2, Afghanistan, so on. But wars constantly. What's striking is that no one knows anyone who is in the military. Why? Because by and large, this is a gross generalization, but there are only really two classes of people who become military. One is essentially poor people, and two would be people who hail from areas with strong military tradition, especially in the U.S. South. So if you teach a place like Berkeley, you never meet anyone who has paid it. It's part of the military. This was not true during the Vietnam War, which is of course one of the reasons that there was so much demonstration against the war. Because if you can be drafted, and maybe die in the jungles of Vietnam, that's a very strong motivation. But if you don't know anyone, and you have no threat that you might be sent to Afghanistan or Iraq, motivation is very weak. Some people still demonstrate it, but it's not the same thing. Second, and in many ways even more crucial, is the fiscal crisis of the state. Essentially, almost all nation states are facing bankruptcy or something close to it. They have huge debt everywhere. There's no exception I can think of, certainly in the OECD countries. Some of the Arab oil export countries may have balance in the black, but all OECD countries have huge debt margin. And this is a huge problem. That arises from the crisis of the tax state. People have trouble collecting taxes now. Why is that? Well, there's so much mobility of capital that you raise taxes and corporations just do it. This usually happens within the country. So if Californians or people in Detroit try to raise taxes, car company will say, oh, no, we'll move some of our plants to Arkansas where the taxes are low, where there are no unions. But this is now done on a global scale. And as I keep on saying, somewhat jokingly, Americans don't make things anymore. In part because all the factories, not all, but many of the factories have left the U.S. Why? Well, labor costs are lower, taxes are lower, no one complains if you pollute. I mean, they may complain, but they don't care about that. And in time of global financialization, there are many tax havens, and governments have horrible time trying to rein in finances, flow of money across national borders. Even 30 years ago, it was just very difficult to move money. A lot of people would try to roll up $100 bills into cigarettes and pick a pack of cigarettes. Try to move money like that. But there's only so much money you can move. But now, with the push of a button, you can move money instantaneously. But the second and even more disturbing thing about the fiscal crisis is the bankruptcy of the welfare state. I mean, the welfare state is a triumph of democratic capitalism, but the trouble is that the costs were always kind of pushed forward. Right? You don't pay now, you pay later. And now people are catching up because the baby boomers, at least in OECD countries everywhere, are getting older. And yet they have fewer children. So the imbalance has become greater and greater. And one of the interesting things about this is that they exist largely in democratic societies where voters do actually have some impact. And what the voters do in this aging society is to protect certain entitlements. So even though a lot of Americans hated this idea of national health insurance, no one wanted to touch Medicare and Medicaid, especially the part that help older people. You can't touch it because there will be a revolution in the U.S. if you get rid of health insurance for older people. And yet they don't pay that much taxes. They're old, they've stopped working, they don't pay taxes. And so younger people have to support them, but there are fewer younger people. And at the same time, what's happening in fact is if you look at actual spending patterns of welfare state, true everywhere, but especially striking in the U.S., is that what gets kind of pushed away, what gets kind of destroyed are things like education and support for younger people. Why? Well, you don't vote. There are fewer of you now. I'm not talking to you, Professor. Younger people. Anyway, so one of the interesting puzzle you can do is just to pretend there are these big blocks of money like education. One of the striking things about the U.S. in the last 4 years is just the secular decline in support for education, especially at the tertiary level, higher ed. Who's paying for it? What's the middle class? And it's a way in which the welfare state has given up because of the fiscal crisis and pushed the cost onto people who don't have much to power, namely younger people, and instead protect things like medical care for older people. I'm sure you know this, but one of the tragedies about life is that basically like over 90% of medical costs in any society go to really old people, and especially in their last year. In the U.S., this is really extreme because, in many ways, because it's the most advanced in terms of technology. Someone actually calculated that something like 99% of these costs go to the last several months because people, as they're dying, they go through this extreme care, right? New medicine, new medical procedures. And if you then calculate all the costs associated with trying to develop these things, they just become astronomical. I'm old, but I never go. I have cost the medical system nothing for many decades. Although I support it, they take money out of my pay, my small pay. You know, like, what are they supporting? Oh. Anyway, sorry, that's a commentary. There's no old person to scream at me. Trying to kill me. There are a couple other things I want to talk about crisis interventions. One thing is that almost everywhere, not everywhere, but almost everywhere, I actually like to argue that it's everywhere, but people disagree, that behind this idea of the nation state was some kind of an idea of Gemeinschaft, kind of more or less homogeneous community. Right? As I say, it's invented, but nonetheless, people kind of believed it, in part because the modern state helped usher in a culture that was more integrated, that was more status integrated as well. So in France, people began to feel that they're really French. They're kind of the same. Spoke the same language, knew the same stupid TV shows, sang the same popular songs, and so on. And this was true almost everywhere. But of course, it turns out, if you think about it for a moment, and if you actually listen to people in therefore areas, there was never ever a monoethnic cult. It was never homogeneous. I mean, you know, when I first came to Finland a long time ago, before you were born, I mean, people in Taipei actually used to say that, yes, we're all Chinese. Right? We're all Chinese. And we're one day conquer mainland. But anyway, so, you know, I thought that there were all these Aboriginal people. Oh, there are very few of them. They'll disappear soon. And one of the things that's fueling this, of course, is this very powerful trend toward individualism. Right? I mean, I'm not going to go on and on, but it really is a powerful force. So if you ever divide human history into two, I think the most salient is that for a very, very, very long time in human history, the collective was more important than the individual. So if you have a chance to kill yourself for a collective, you do it. And you can kind of see this in some way, even in World War I. Otherwise, individualistic and modern-seeming Europeans, young people, who were very often elite, right? But not going for them. I mean, they could have spent 50 years drinking very good wine. They volunteered. And it's not like they didn't know that they had a very high chance of dying, because obviously it was going in the newspaper. In the Battle of the Somme, 1 million people died. Incredible. So you knew, I mean, in trench warfare, I mean, there were not many movies, but you heard the stories of this horrible. You know, I'm sure you know from movies. You should watch more movies if you don't. They dug these trenches, and there's a sat there for weeks, fighting over a few meters, essentially. And sometimes, as I say, in the case of the Somme, 1 million people die. It's hard. I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe some of you want to do this. It's really hard to believe that many people today want to do this. Why? Well, one simplistic perhaps explanation is, you know, as Americans like to say, you, number one, is more important than the rest. Do I really want to kill myself if I were? For France? For America? I mean, some people still do, of course. But increasingly, the individual seems just more important. And the last point I make is, of course, just there are all sorts of new forms of inequality that are becoming very, very evident. I mentioned this split between a globalizing elite, you know, people who like you speak English, and they'll probably have good jobs, national jobs, international jobs, and the rest of people in Taiwan who cannot get international jobs, except maids or something like that, maid or janitor or something, or even national jobs, elite jobs in Taipei. And that kind of divide is relatively new. And I haven't done comparative research, actually, but I'm actually convinced that in all these national universities in East Asia, the stratification of the background of students has become much more intense. I mean, that is to say, if you went back to the 50s and 60s, Tokyo University, Seoul National Science University too, I'm sure, there are always these country geniuses from the countryside who could do well in exams and get into the #1 university or something like that. I mean, I can tell you for sure that in the case of Tokyo and Seoul, this is not the case. The vast majority, especially in Seoul, come from Seoul. But not just from Seoul, but Gangnam, the rich area of Seoul. And Seoul National University is in Gangnam, so people don't even leave Gangnam to the university. And you see very few people in the countryside, almost none. And it's a very, very striking difference. But the final footnote I'll make is this is accentuated even in the US by globalization and in particular global financialization. The Americans talk about 1%, but it's not really 1%. It's the 0.0001%. It's pushing prices so that it lives in a completely different world from the rest of America. So, for example, there are several areas in the U.S. where housing prices have rose dramatically. Where are they? Well, Manhattan, that's where the financial elites are, and Silicon Valley, San Francisco area, where I live, because of Silicon Valley and the technological elite. And the gap between them and the rest is just one of the more striking facts for America. No, when I was growing up in the U.S., everyone thought Americans were free. That was the ideology. It wasn't true, of course. There was always inequality. And there were always sociologists that say, oh, no, America's a by the end. But now, no one believes America's equal. It's one of the truly revolutionary change in American society. I mean, you have to go to some very uneducated person to say America's still equal. Basically, even right-wing people know that America's highly unequal. Because it's so obvious. Finally, I think there's something like what I call a scissor effect, right? Essentially, the nation-state seem to work fine because almost everything seems to happen nationally. And one of the way you can measure this is if you look at headlines from 1960s and 70s, most of the news were national news. I mean, it still is in some places. But many of the problems that affect us today are not national in character. They're not even international. They're actually supranational, meaning environmental crisis. Even if Taiwan has the most green environmental policy in the world, it doesn't make you a very green country because mainland China will continue to pollute and send you pollutants. You don't have nuclear, you decide to get rid of nuclear generator, you can be free from nuclear waste? No. Japan will continue to use nuclear power. Maybe Fukushima will happen in Kyushu something. And you'll be able to fit efficiently. Anyway, you understand what I'm saying. And this is not just the environment, that's the most obvious. No one really believes today that economy is a national issue. Why does Taiwan get depressed? I mean, no one truly believes you can just fix it within Taiwan. It's a global wide trend. You can't stop. So, in many ways, at one level, the nation state can do very little. Modern state can do very little because it's just kind of a global thing. It just kind of comes like a wave. At the same time, a lot of things start happening within any nation state, which is purely subnational. And I mentioned things like Scotland or Catalonia. I mean, one of the things that's happening is that they feel that to have control over their lives. And very often people think it's a purely national or ethnic or linguistic phenomenon, but I actually think that's not true. The Catalonians are a very good example. It's, I think by law, every Catalonian publication from the academies have to be in two languages, Catalonian and English, but not Spanish. Because they know that it's not that good just to publish in Catalonian. I mean, very few people read Catalonian. It's a very unusual language in the US. Very few people outside don't know anything about it. So it's not that they're being particularistic and closed, just as a secessionist. No, they want to play part in the whole wide world. It's just that it's much better to take care of things in this region. Right? So it's actually, in some way, very democratic. And you might argue that it's because they're very wealthy and they don't want to, share the wealth of Catalonia with the rest of Spain, and that's certainly an element of that there. But there's a true sense in which Catalonians want, to have more control rather than relying on bureaucrats in Madrid to decide on their fate. So between the two, our problem seems really intractable, meaning they're outside the state's control, and at the same time, there are these democratic disturbers. People want autonomy, regional, local autonomy. So, where are they at? Well, at the same time, at one level, then they're in a very, very hard place. As I mentioned, all the problem seems to be beyond the reaches of the nation state, and yet the present problems seem only solvable at a local level, the region. At the same time, almost all other nation states, in fact, I must say all other nation states, certainly in OECD countries, seem very weak, right? Because they can't solve problems. They can't solve all the problems that are so important in everyday life. And I think there was a kind of illusion that state could solve problems because once you could do things like provide free public education, you could provide free national insurance, you could provide unemployment insurance, all the great things about the welfare state. But even they are under constant attack because of the fiscal crisis I mentioned. The state actually can't do very much more. And given that, they can't use the fear. If you're in France of Germany attacking, if you're in Germany of France attacking, then it's hard to justify large military or even have kind of hawkish nationalist stance. Again, just to be dramatic, if you were able to go back in the time machine, the one thing about today's Europe that will strike Europeans in the 18th century as basically impossible would be that France and Germany are friends, and probably to the extent two countries least likely to go to war against each other. Given that for much of modern Europe, that's all that they're fighting each other constantly. That's all they do. Not even it's almost impossible. At the same time, as I say, there's just a lot of intranational resistance to what the state wants to do. Everyone's against you. There are people who are against globalization because they're left out. And even the demands of nationalism are quite contradictory. So what happens then? Well, so you try to create things like EU, right? Why did EU arise? Well, I mean, the usual narrative that's given is, of course, that the 20th century showed the implausibility of nationalism on war. And that, in a sense, that cooperation rather than conflict is the way forward. But I actually think the real reason EU really kind of gains some steam and some enthusiasm, if you will, for politicians in Europe, is really the sense that's very pervasive in Europe, that Europe is becoming increasingly irrelevant. After all, actually, I'm talking about Eurocentrism, even though I mean Americocentrism, let's say. But it really is true that for a long time, Europeans, especially educated Europeans, thought that they were at the center of the universe. And it was true because, of course, Asians thought so too, and so did Latin Americans, and so did educated Africans. And it was for long true in Germany, as certainly for long true in UK and France and so on. They feel like they're the center of civilization and so on. However, at least since 1945, very few people think that Europe is truly at the center. Germany gets taken over by the U.S., mainly because all the great German scientists went to the U.S. and you have the Jews. But more importantly, U.S. became kind of a magnet for latest research in almost everything, including social sciences. But there's another threat, which is the rise of East Asia. One of the more interesting things, if you go to Europe and talk to these European academics or intellectuals, is really kind of the sense that maybe Europe is not going to Asia. One of the most shocking experiences I had, I think. I mean, it's very subtle, so it's not shocking to you, perhaps. Is that very well-known scholar of Weber, Max Weber, a professor in Germany, came and visit me in Berkeley, and then he saw that I had German languages, and he was really shocked. He says, "Why do you have that?" And I said, "Weber wrote it." It's like good to read original. Germany used to be the center of social theory. Of course I should be reading. He says, "Really? No one thinks that." And I said, "Why are you so worried?" And he said, "Well, he assumed I'm Korean because I said I was born in Korea." So he said, "I don't read Korean." I mean, it's a very subtle point, but the very idea that a German professor, scholar of Max Weber, should think somehow that German and Korean are equal. I know German, so he should know Korean. It's a mindset that would have been just inconceivable, certainly before 1945, and I would say until 1980s. The flip side is, it sounds kind of racist because it was, but I mean, one of the reasons I didn't go to Germany to study, I have many reasons, but I think one of the main reasons is, people would actually say when I talk to them, and when to talk about maybe possibly studying in Germany, actually most people said, "Why?" My father. But some of them said something slightly different. They said, well, they could see that I'm of Asian descent, so they would say, I'm not sure if you could really understand social theory. I said, why? And essentially, basically, the story was, I don't have the spirit. Christ. This European spirit. So I would never be able to understand social theory. So, if you look at that kind of Eurocentrism, if you will, racism even, 30 years later, the guy saying, I don't know Korea. I don't think people 30 years ago even knew what Korea was. Right? So it's just a different way in which Europeans think about the rest of the world. So all I'm saying is that I think there's a sense of decline in any case. So EU comes to be. And what's interesting is, of course, once EU comes to be, there are enough East Asians who are still instinctively following Europe. So they start wondering, maybe we should have EU in East Asia. And create whatever East Asia Union. Well, it's not possible. I think I'm going to skip this slide because it's kind of getting late. Well, I don't think so. I don't see how this is possible anytime soon. And you may disagree or you may agree. Because one of the reasons that EU is possible is the backdrop of 2 world wars. And you really think that you never want to fight ever again. And yet, in many ways, East Asia is very different because its historical imaginaries, national imaginaries, are very different. I mean, I'm making it very, very concise to the point. It's a caricature. But what do people think? I mean, of course, I know that there are 1.4 billion Chinese. They think completely differently. But to the extent you can identify one simple sentence, what summary? it's really this idea that China used to be great, but China has been humiliated in the 20th century, colonized, losing war to Japan, blah, blah, blah. Well, how about the Koreans? It's simple. It's colonized by Japan, and there was Korean War. These are one sentence overview of East Asian history. Japan is the most interesting case. They don't remember. I mean, they kind of remember there was a war and it was very painful. It's very hard to say who began it. And I say this kind of slightly jokingly, but it's important because it plays a very powerful role in politics, and especially populist measures. And I'll give you a reason why. One of the reasons Japan is unusual is, I think, because the right and the left actually came to kind of a draw. The grandfather of the current prime minister, Abe, his name, for complicated reason, is a different last name. His name was Kishi. Really wanted to bring back kind of pre-war Japan, demilitarized in many ways. And one of the ways in which this came to head was when he tried to force the national security treaty between U.S. and Japan. And this creates a huge demonstration in Japan. People take over Tokyo University, people take over National Assembly building, Diet building, and so on. And basically he loses. Kishi loses. And what that meant was that until his grandson came to become prime minister, no one made a serious effort to demilitarize Japan ideologically. And so one of the reasons you can remember is that people just can't create either a narrative of greatness about the past or a narrative of the leftist narrative about how it's all bad, which actually was dominant. Okay, so what's the difference? Well, of course it's completely different. As I say, the past of international conflict is dead. It's not so in East Asia. In each country, the historiography continues to be nationalist. It's really a nationalist history people want to rehearse. And this is the reason that there are these very stupid struggles in East Asia, even today, over things that truly don't matter. Right? So you have territorial disputes, and sometimes it's slightly more consequential than others. Senkaku or Diaoyu. There's a dispute, of course, between Taiwan, Japan, and China. Koreans and Japanese claim they hate each other in these surveys. Actually, the likes are very, very low. It's about 27, 29%. Koreans have favorable attitudes to Japan. Why? Because Japanese claim sovereignty over this rock, Takeshima or Tokyo. And aside from Takeshima, it's technically not an island because it can't really sustain the life. And the same for these kind of bizarre hyper-nationalist flare-ups over, say, Yasukuni Shrine. Abe wants to go because he says he wants to honor the war dead, war heroes. Everyone else says it's honoring war colonialists, colonial oppressors. What's really interesting about Yasukuni, this is just a side note or footnote, is of course that if you actually study who's being honored, actually there's some people that you would go Taiwanese, and quite a few were Koreans. Because many Taiwanese and Koreans in the 1940s thought that they were really part of the Japanese empire. And some were brave enough or stupid enough to volunteer and then become quasi-pirates. And Koreans can't really handle this because in the nationalist historiography, South Koreans and North Koreans, of course, too, were resisting Japanese imperialism every day. It was a defeat battle for the collaborators. But the reality was that the vast majority of the intellectuals were pro-Japanese, and some of them grew up thinking they wanted to hold themselves up, at least zero times, to honor the Japanese empire. So you wonder why people have such bad national historiography. It's because it has to depend on forgetting the past. Okay. So what I'm trying to say is that in some very funny way, East Asia is out of whack. Because we can't even think of what a common enemy might be for East Asia. What are we fighting against? And we can't even think what we're fighting for. So in either way, there is no commonality that binds East Asia, even in this very, very weak sense that EU is kind of. So what I've concluded with is a very simple thought. Right? There is no sense of East Asia, actually. And in fact, there is actually not even a sense of crisis. And not even common enemies, as I keep on saying. I mean, yes, people worry about the rise of China, people worry about renationalizing Japan, people worried about Korean Peninsula. But really, those are very, very unlikely worries. You know, I'm talking way too much, so I'm going to skip these ideas and just kind of conclude with a very interesting, very weird thought about East Asia, which is that because, this is the punchline, because the social theory or social science had in some ways failed to make sense of the regional and local realities. What dominates in common understanding is, I keep on saying, this nationalist narrative. And these are nationalist narratives which are very impoverished in some way. And so we actually don't even have conceptual tools to make sense of what is going on. So to just talk about China very, very briefly, right? As I said in passing, the thing about China is that we think it's a nation state, like France or Germany. It's not a nation state, it's a continent. It's more people than Europe. And as I mentioned, the linguist who made a study of it says there's more linguistic diversity within China than there is in Europe. And yet there is this myth of nation state that even the Chinese really believe in. Which is why, if you actually open what moves China, a lot of it is about combating threats against disintegration. Why are they so worried? They're worried because, well, they don't care about Tibet. Of course, they think they're backward and semi-civilized and so on and on. But they're not really worried. They're worried because they feel surrounded by these secessionists. Why do I think, just to pose another question, the Korean Peninsula won't be unified anytime soon? Well, it's because of China. Because if Korea should be unified, not only will there be U.S. military doing it, but there will be probably secessionist movement, irredentist movement among the Koreans and Bulgaria and so on. So I don't want to go on and on, but one of the reasons I was interested in this topic and wanted to talk to you about it is a very simple thing, that because in these nation states, they haven't developed kind of social sciences or social analysis or social criticism that can make sense of the concrete within comparative historical context. We have social sciences on the one hand, which don't actually talk about even the reality that we're facing. And on the other, these nationalist discourses, which willfully ignore what actually is happening. Okay, so what we have then is simply that there's a fundamental ambivalence at work, meaning that yes, people like to talk about the dream of East Asia, the specter of Asian century, so so on and on. Because there's dynamism in the economy, it's growing. People in Europe and US think that the center of the world will shift to China or East Asia. So that's one of the ambivalences. So people are very optimistic. They think East Asia will be center. At the same time, I actually think that not only people have no idea what's going on by and large, but there's simultaneously a serious doubt and insecurity about East Asia. And this comes from just, again, very simple narrative, right? You weren't born, but Japanese actually believed that they were going to essentially conquer East and Southeast Asia. The Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Dispute. They failed. But after the end of World War II, Japan came back. And in 1979, Mizuho published a book called Japan is Number One. And actually in the 1980s, many Japanese actually kind of believed that Japan was going to be number one. They're going to buy up America. They began to look down on Americans and Europeans, blah, blah, blah. But basically, China is kind of the same. For a long time, Europeans and Americans thought that was a sleeping tiger, was going to wake up and take over the world. Never happened. Didn't come close. Now we think it's a roaring dragon in the imagery of most business people's books sold in American airports. China is a dragon about to roar. It's live. Do people really believe this in China? Not actually sure. Actually, I think they're much more realistic in some way than CP people. Second is, of course, that there's so much geopolitical conflict fueled by the misunderstanding, as I keep saying, of these nationalist discourses. And that makes them completely unable to cooperate, and cooperation actually will yield great things for obvious reasons. The third and final thing I'll say is that, and this is what makes social sciences bad in general in East Asia, is the traditional following. It's just following. It makes the innovation. People in the West, now Americans, so they're learning. But obviously, when you just learn, you can't really be the innovator. But more importantly, you can't really understand what goes on where you live, because people outside don't really care about where you live. So the punchline of this, I would say, is that in this age of globalization, many things seem to be changing. And they are changing, but we don't seem to have very good conceptual tools to make sense of it. Again, globalization provides a simple narrative, but it's very ideological. It's saying that financial globalization and therefore economic and over-time cultural globalization is inevitable. No point in fighting. It's just a better way to do it. On the other hand, we have all these nationalists screaming about national greatness and so on. But as I keep on insisting, they have very, very problematic understanding of what goes on. So there's this wide center which will take the best of what the Western social sciences have to offer and yet be able to make sense of contemporary reality, parts of the past. This thing I keep on saying is called knowledge of the present, which no one or very few people are doing. And it's this impoverishment of social analysis, social theory, social science, whatever you can call it, that I actually think fuels the problems within these stages. Okay, why don't we take a 10-minute break and come back.